Thank you all for being here. To get our conversation started, I actually want to invite you to respond to the following question in the chat. What are some of the most supportive or unsupportive responses you've gotten from others when they learned you have narcolepsy? And if you don't have narcolepsy, maybe another sleep disorder or some other chronic invisible condition. So I'll give you a few moments to respond to this prompt in the chat. Okay, thank you so much for sharing. So on the supportive end, I'm hearing things like, "Tell me more about that," or um, maybe a neutral response, "What's that?" And now I'm hearing a lot of unsupportive responses. "Oh yeah, everyone's tired. Wow, it must be nice to fall asleep so easily. Oh, at least you don't have blank." Um, "Oh, I get it. I'm so tired," right? Uh, wow, I have a disabled friend. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Isn't it wild how just one comment can make or break our day? And I know some of you, the comments that you're writing, you have heard these not just one time, but 4 times or 14 times, and maybe you're just tapped out. Um, we spend our whole lives communicating. So this is happening all the time. And when we communicate, we're stringing together words and actions into messages, making meaning of the words and actions and messages of others as well. And this is really the process that I've spent the last 15 years studying. It's the communication process. That's where I've spent my academic career. So before moving to Oregon to work at George Fox University, I earned my PhD in interpersonal and health communication. Interpersonal communication might be familiar, how we connect with the people we're close to, but I imagine health communication might be a new term for some of you. And the study of health communication explores everything from doctor patient communication and media portrayals of health to how we support loved ones through health crises. My own research, like Tammy said, has focused on how couples communicate about invisible health conditions, especially ones that are stigmatized or poorly understood. Things like chronic pain, mental illness, addiction, sexual dysfunction, and so on. CDC defines invisible illness as those that interfere with the usual activities of daily life, but are not immediately obvious to others. And so communicating about these can be tricky. And as I'm sure many of you have experienced, this might delay our care or undermine our treatment. Now, my initial interest in studying invisible illness was personal. My mom actually has suffered with a host of autoimmune diseases and severe chronic pain for most of my life, though you might not know it necessarily by looking at her. And this connection, combined with my own journey navigating chronic health issues, drew me to this research. Now, I want to be clear. I do not have narcolepsy or a formally diagnosed sleep disorder. My understanding of narcolepsy has grown over the past year after getting to know one of my dear students who has narcolepsy, and I've been deeply honored to be invited into this space with you all. So, my expertise today isn't on sleep itself, but on the communication dynamics surrounding chronic illness and disability. And with my students' help, I've worked to tailor this specifically to the experiences of those who have narcolepsy or other sleep disorders. So I'll try to integrate some examples where I can, but I won't pretend for a second that I know what it's like to be in your shoes. Whether you have a sleep disorder or you are here because you care about someone who does. And I hope that even if we don't address your specific situation, that you'll walk away with a simple framework for navigating communication dilemmas you might face at work or in relationships or at the doctor's office. And as Tammy said, at the end we'll have time for Q&A, and I'll share some digital resources with you in the chat and on the slides that will be yours to take home. And again, I'd love to use this chat as a way to interact together. So um, if you have a question that you don't feel comfortable putting in the Q&A, I also have this phone number that you can text questions to if you're more comfortable doing that. Though my understanding is that the Q&A is also private, so no one should see your questions there either. And I'll leave this number at the bottom of the screen in case you want to text your question there. And again, thank you so much for all of the responses that you shared already in the chat. Okay, so let's dive in. So people with chronic invisible illnesses share common experiences, but each diagnosis, and as we're seeing even in your responses, and even within a single diagnosis, people face unique communication challenges and preferences. Dr. Nicole Eugene, a communication professor with narcolepsy, explores this in her book, Narratives of Narcolepsy in Everyday Life. So rather than presuming I know what your experience is like, I want to hear from you again. Take a moment to think about your own day-to-day experience. And in a phrase or a sentence, how would you describe what it's like to live with or to support someone with a sleep disorder? So take 30 seconds or so to think about this prompt. And if you're comfortable, share that phrase or sentence in the chat. And I'll read some of them aloud. The Walking Dead, completely unpredictable and challenging to plan around. Identity altering, yeah. Disheartening and frustrating. As a supporter, it can be frustrating and unpredictable. So I'm hearing a lot of unpredictability, constant surprises, a lot of adapting that you have to do. Yeah, hard to commit to anything, can't predict how I'll feel on a given day. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. Ping pong, someone says. Feels like I'm fighting anesthesia all day. These are really powerful descriptors. Um, and kind of part of why I wanted to ask you this is because your responses illustrate how sleep disorders are not just about feeling tired. There's so many misconceptions. They involve the challenge of timing naps around your life, the frustration of managing medication, the emotional toll of depression or anxiety that can come with narcolepsy, the constant navigating of social misunderstandings and self-disclosure. Now, thankfully, a lot of the Western world is trying to adopt more of a biopsychosocial model when talking about chronic illness, since it captures how multidimensional the health experience can be. Given my focus on communication, we'll zero in on the social aspects today, which is particularly crucial because of the social challenges often faced by those with narcolepsy. So again, because the experience of chronic illness is so layered, so are the communication challenges that come with it. Health communication research in this area tends to focus on issues like disclosure, stigma, and label management. Now, I imagine the next scenario may resonate with some of you. In order to get the care that you need to share about your condition with your boss or teacher or your parent or your doctor. But because of the stigmas, misconceptions, and lack of knowledge surrounding sleep disorders, your medical concerns are, or your needs are denied or invalidated or minimized. How many of you have been brave enough to disclose only for someone to respond with something about drinking more caffeine or getting more sleep? Or maybe you've heard the classic, you don't look sick, you look great. Or you get a fire hose of outlandish questions about your diagnosis. And invalidation of invisible illness by doctors can be amplified for people in marginalized populations. For instance, women are often assumed to be overreacting or told it's all in their head. And similarly, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, especially African Americans, often face assumptions of higher pain tolerance, especially for chronic pain conditions. To compound matters, for narcolepsy, the typical onset I've learned is between age 10 and 20, meaning uh, for many of you or your loved ones, navigating these challenges during childhood or adolescence was your experience. My student I mentioned earlier shared with me how often children's symptoms are minimized. Oh, she's just depressed, or he just doesn't sleep well. And this makes early communication about their experiences incredibly difficult for both the child and their parents. Now, chronic illness, as we see, often comes with chronic invalidation, and it can take years to get a correct diagnosis. For narcolepsy, the journey can be incredibly long. Some research says 8 to 15 years on average. Out of curiosity, for those here who have narcolepsy, how many years did it take for you to get a diagnosis, if you're comfortable sharing? 9 years, 15, 5, 9, over a decade. Wow. That's that's 15 years of fighting for a diagnosis. And even then, sometimes the diagnosis is questioned. Well, are you sure that's what it is? But also, a diagnosis can be a huge relief. As Dr. Eugene writes, before being diagnosed with narcolepsy, many of my participants, myself included, were told, there's nothing wrong with you, or we're misdiagnosed, compelling a choice between distrusting our own knowledge about our bodies or distrusting the judgment of a medical professional. Once diagnosed, however, people with narcolepsy are released from epistemic invalidation. In other words, like the chronic dismissal of their experiences and knowledge. Okay, so now you have a diagnosis, but how will you describe that to others? What label will you use? And again, I'm seeing your responses here in the chat. Thank you so much for sharing. And your responses really illustrate a lot of what we're talking about. So how will you label your diagnosis? Now, many people with chronic health conditions or disabilities prefer person first language, which emphasizes the person before the disability. So she's a person with narcolepsy. But others prefer identity first language since it kind of captures the all encompassing reality that you might live in, and can reclaim disability as a positive and key aspect of your identity. So maybe you actually prefer to identify as narcoleptic. Again, out of curiosity, how do you prefer to identify yourself to others when you do choose to disclose that you have narcolepsy? Because sometimes we assume someone prefers one label when actually there might be a variety of preferences. So some say person first. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And the comorbidities, that's a whole other aspect to your lived experience too, for sure. So most of you are saying person first language. Um, the takeaway here is, or to give actually one more example, um, many people do prefer to be called a person with a disability, but Many folks also prefer the term disabled, again, because it can reclaim that identity and that all encompassing experience. But the takeaway is that people might prefer different labels for different, very valid reasons. And yet, maybe you've been rubbed the wrong way when someone didn't use the label you prefer. And maybe that even caused you to limit how much you share, right? So back to the disclosure, which then might reinforce people's assumptions because now in you not sharing, they're not getting the chance to learn accurate information about narcolepsy. And so it can become this vicious cycle, right? Which can be super exhausting. So, what can we do to improve our communication so that we get the right kind of support or meds or even diagnosis? And if we're here because we support someone in our lives that we care about who has a sleep disorder or some other hidden illness or disability, how can we improve our communication too? Now, before we answer these questions, feel free to just take a moment to stretch. I know we've already been here for like 20 minutes. So if you need to stand up or shake it out or maybe a gentle twist, feel free to do that. Just want to pause for a sec. Now let's get back into it. What can we do? So, to set the stage for some communication strategies, um, let's tap in again to the resources that you already have. And let's think a little bit about your life and what you might hope for in your communication. So, take a moment to write in the chat one way that you excel at communicating with others about your sleep disorder. Or if you're here supporting someone with a sleep disorder, what's one way that you excel in your communication? And then what's one way that you want to grow in your communication with others? So take a minute to think about this and we can unpack it a little bit. Thank you so much for what those of you who have contributed or are sharing. So I'm hearing um, our strengths. What are our strengths? Trying to be authentic, right? Um, I'm hearing more about where do I want to grow. So um, maybe minimizing my feelings, maybe deferring to other people's needs or putting my needs on the back burners. Maybe I'm making an assumption there. Um, I want to be more patient with my child. I want to be more open about it. I excel at giving more information if I gauge genuine interest, or less if I can sense the person needs a simple answer, or nothing at all if explaining will be futile. Yeah. So kind of assessing uh, who is this person? What can they handle? What are their goals in this interaction? Um, it's so vulnerable, right? How much do we share? Who do we share with? And for many of you, and even one of the questions I've gotten, which we can address later, you know, I have to ask for accommodations from my boss. Like, how do I do that? Yeah, I want to apologize less. Yeah, when explaining accommodations, absolutely. I want to help my loved one trust communicating about their diagnosis, trusting their voice too, right? Thank you so much again for sharing. Um, Gosh, I can imagine how exhausting it must be to have to be constantly educating others about your sleep disorder, um, and trying to just manage your life, right? And yet we getting the right kind of support requires that disclosure and communication. Okay, so there's no single formula for smooth interactions, unfortunately. So that's the bad news. And choosing how to communicate and what to communicate is often an adaptive process. It can be messy. It can require you to evaluate the situation and kind of rule out strategies that don't fit. And what works at one time might not work during another time. But because I do love a good 3-point framework, I'll give you a couple of questions that I think might be able to help you think through whether you want to disclose your diagnosis and how much you want to share, regardless of the situation you're going into. So, and we'll go over each of these questions. So, the first question is, what is my relationship with the person I'm disclosing to? How do I think they'll respond to what I will share? And what's my goal in sharing this information? So, let's break each of these down in detail. First, what is my relationship with the person I'm disclosing to? Now, obviously, our conversations with our clinicians will look different than conversations with our best friends or our romantic partners. And this has a lot to do with what we hope to achieve by sharing. For example, sharing a new symptom with our doctor because we need to adjust our meds, or disclosing to a professor or a boss how our accommodations might impact our work. I'm going to point you to a few resources that are way more detailed towards the end of our time, and it might tackle some of these situations more specifically. But since my research has looked mostly at close relationships, that's where I'll keep the focus for the time being. Now, we see in the research time and time again that having supportive people in our lives is good for our health. The support of others can reduce our stress, which is important since stress can exacerbate many chronic health issues. And one thing I find super interesting from social support research is that just knowing we have people in our corner might be more helpful for reducing our stress than the actual quality of people's support. In other words, someone might not respond perfectly when you go to them, but if you know they love you and that they're trying their best, it can still be helpful. That said, responses do matter. And the response that we anticipate matters. It actually plays a bigger role in predicting whether we'll disclose than how close we are. So, in other words, even if I know someone loves me, if I know they're probably going to suggest that I try this new supplement or get more sleep or whatever it is, I might be less likely to share when I'm having a rough day. And some of your responses earlier kind of illustrated that. Which is why another question to ask yourself when deciding what to disclose is, how do I think they'll respond to what I share? If we think they'll respond supportively, we're more likely to share, and it will likely benefit the relationship. Big surprise. Responses that are perceived to be more supportive are those that recognize and legitimize our feelings and our experiences. And then, of course, less supportive responses, as we've already talked about, are the ones that deny, minimize, or criticize our feelings or experiences, which often involves people trying to problem solve for us. I'm sure you've experienced that. Now, an interesting finding in the disclosure research is that if we anticipate a negative response, it can lead us to delay sharing about our diagnosis or our needs, right? Because it's uncomfortable. And then when we eventually do share, the person who hears that information might feel hurt by the delay or kind of shocked or surprised, potentially leading to the negative reaction that we initially feared. This creates what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy, where our initial belief, by shaping our actions, then confirms our belief. So complicated, right? But responses also go beyond what happens in the moment. We also have to think, what will this person do with the information we've shared with them? Studies have shown that if we have a close relationship with someone, or if someone is bound by confidentiality, like a licensed counselor or therapist, they're more likely to deal with our information how we want. So that's good news. But we also know that doesn't always happen. When someone shares our private information, it can break our trust and be devastating to the relationship. And also, when we share with what's called in the research a reluctant confidant, basically a person who wasn't expecting or wanting to hear about our health information, they might not feel as much of a responsibility to keep our information private. So, this should all give us good reason to think seriously about the boundaries we want to have around our information. Now, one clue that might help us know whether someone is safe to share with is to pay attention to how they communicate about the other people in their lives when we're with them. Is this a person that seems to honor other people's privacy, or do they gossip or tell you other people's private information, maybe as a way of trying to connect with you or to feel better about themselves? So it's definitely important to think about who the person is and how we think they might respond. But I think the last question here might be the most helpful one we can ask ourselves. What is my goal in sharing this information? In other words, why do I want to share? What am I hoping to get out of this interaction? Am I looking for medical advice? Am I asking for an accommodation, which I need to do? Or do I just really need to vent about my symptoms right now? And I just don't even want someone to respond. I just need to get it out there. Now, Dr. Brene Brown, who's a sociologist that studies shame and vulnerability, so fun, she defines vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. So this includes things like waiting for the doctor to call back, or asking your boss or your professor for accommodations, or applying for that job, even though you know it's going to be a huge adjustment. These are vulnerable situations, and it's crucial to lean into that vulnerability over time if it's going to help us achieve our goals. But vulnerability isn't the same thing as oversharing. In fact, Brown emphasizes that we often overshare as a defense mechanism against true vulnerability. When we impulsively share too much too soon, maybe we're trying to test someone's capacity for support or see if they can handle us, um, we can risk overwhelming them, and their resulting discomfort may not really be a reflection of their inability to support us, but perhaps a reflection of our own lack of boundaries in the moment, um, which can lead to a negative response from them. And again, that can become another self-fulfilling prophecy because it confirms our initial fear. Oh, they're just not safe, right? Um, when we impulsively um, share too much, that can happen, right? So Brown writes that vulnerability is based on mutuality and requires boundaries and trust. It's not oversharing, purging, indiscriminate disclosure, celebrity style social media information dumps. It's about sharing our feelings and our experiences with people who have earned the right to hear them. And for Brown, the people that we share all of the deepest stuff with, like the people who know everything, should fit on a 1 by 1 inch square. That's her perspective. That's what, like 5 names probably. So she says if you're sharing with more people than that about everything, you're probably sharing with too many people. So some different perspectives on sharing. So, to this point, we've covered questions that you can ask yourself if you're the one with the sleep disorder. So, what's my relationship to the person? How do I think they'll respond? What's my goal? But what if you're here because you're providing support? I want to address those of you here providing support too. So, remember how we defined vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure? Well, it can be just as vulnerable, or maybe even more so, to be on the receiving end of someone sharing about their health. How many of you have felt so helpless when someone shared something really painful they were going through? We might say too much, or we might not say enough because we're so worried about saying the wrong thing. Um, Now, that's assuming we're trying our best and genuinely not seeking to cause harm to others. Um, it can be tough. So, here are some basic do's and don'ts that might be useful to you, though, of course, it's going to depend on this specific situation. Avoid saying nothing. I can tell you from research and personal experience that people with chronic illness and disability would rather us say something instead of smiling awkwardly and changing the subject. That said, what you say and how you say it is super important. So avoid saying, you know what they must be going through. I think someone mentioned that earlier, or you know how they feel. And avoid problem solving, giving advice, or assuming you know what they need, medically or otherwise. Instead, seek understanding and communicate with a tone of genuine curiosity, care, and calmness. So rather than asking anxious questions that make it about you and your fears, which I have totally done before, um, take some deep breaths and really try to understand their experience. Or even say something like, I'm worried I might say the wrong thing, but I want you to know I care about you so much and I'm here for you. You can also just sit with someone in their grief by showing nonverbal comfort, maybe matching their facial expressions and their body language. If they're leaning, you kind of lean, using comforting touch if appropriate. And you can finally just ask, what do you need? What do you need right now? Do you want my input, or do you want me to just listen? Do you need to just vent? And over time, you'll likely be able to pick up on what they need, even if it means some more direct communication at first. So that's a lot. As we begin to wrap up and move to your questions, here are just a few more suggestions that you might find useful, especially if you are here as someone with narcolepsy. First, promote accurate understanding by sharing your lived experiences. So, some of those things you shared at the very beginning were really powerful. And Dr. Eugene, who I mentioned earlier, found that medical terms often fall short of capturing the full reality of living with narcolepsy. So, for instance, one of her participants, instead of saying brain fog, um, said, my thoughts dropped out of my head. And that can provide a more vivid picture. These descriptions are powerful tools for building empathy and accurate understanding with the people you're talking to. And Eugene is actually pushing for the medical community to integrate these kinds of descriptions into clinical diagnoses, especially since terms like excessive daytime sleepiness or sleep attacks might be vague in some cases or might not get you the kind of help or support you need. Second, ask for what you need. Now, I know many of you have been kind of wondering about this. We don't have time to go into all the details here about talking with doctors, but I'll send you a digital handout that has some great information about this. There will be a section on pointers from an amazing book about health communication and health advocacy, which is a great read if you want or if you get the chance to read it. I also linked an article from a health communication organization that has a list of questions you can ask your doctor that can help you advocate for yourself and what you need. The last thing I want to say is, unless you're talking with ChatGPT, when you're communicating about your health, you're interacting with another human being. who has their own emotions and feelings and past experiences. And oftentimes, people are trying their best, just like all of us are. So, can we humanize the other person, be it the doctor, friend, family member, while still communicating our needs and honoring our boundaries? Can we choose to listen non defensively if their response isn't perfect? This is particularly hard with doctors, and I know many of you have experienced immense frustration here. Research shows a vicious cycle can emerge where patients feel invalidated if doctors dismiss physical symptoms as psychological, leading to frustration and a rejection of that diagnosis. And then doctors, in turn, feel their expertise is being questioned. So both sides are trying to protect their identity and integrity, and it can lead them to communicating with each other based on stereotypes. Now, again, this is not to say we don't correct the doctor or advocate for ourselves. But if we pause, take a deep breath, and remember the other person's humanity, we'll probably increase the chances that our own response will get us the support we need, or at least move us closer to that. So, to recap, today we talked about how it can be challenging to disclose our diagnosis or our experience to others because of the stigmas and misconceptions people have. We covered some guiding questions and suggestions that might help facilitate smoother interactions, whether you have a sleep disorder or other invisible chronic condition or are supporting someone who does. And I'm sure that we haven't covered even a fraction of the kinds of communication dilemmas that you find yourselves in each day. But I hope that you know that your voice is one of the most powerful tools you have, whether you're using it to advocate for yourself or even taking a break from talking to really listen to the person you're supporting. And remember that a little bit of grace for yourself and others, and maybe a quick read through of the extra content I'll send you in a second. Um, those things can go a long way when it comes to getting the support you need. So thank you so much for allowing me to enter into this space with you all. We should have about 20 minutes for questions, and I've left my contact information on this slide if that's useful. I'll send you a digital copy of one of the resources, and then I'll send you the PDF of these slides in the chat here, and I think Tammy and Jenny will send those out as well. Um, and if you want to scan this QR code, that will also link you to the resources that I'll share. So thank you so much. I will grab you those links here. Second. I see some of you have found it, so that's perfect. Okay, gonna send a link to a Google Doc in the chat. So this is very, very long. I got really into it and also had the assistance of Google Gemini to help tailor some of the content specifically to living with narcolepsy and sleep disorders. Um, so we have that, and then I will send you the slides in the chat here. 1 second. And then we can turn to your questions. Okay. Okay, slides not working, but I will have Tammy or Jenny send those out later. All right. So I'm going to stop the screen sharing so I can address your questions more easily. Okay, so thank you so much for the questions that I'm seeing. Let me see what we can turn to. Just see what this question says. Any insight on whether it's better to disclose illness to someone early in the relationship versus waiting until it directly affects them? For dating too, post it on your bio or wait until you find out or find someone and are already in a relationship. This is so, again, so tricky, and part of what drew me to the research around this topic, because your health and their health, your health will affect them and their health will affect you, right? If you ultimately choose to be in a committed partnership with someone. Um, and I think what Brene Brown says about this, as far as are we oversharing and sharing too much too soon because we're kind of trying to test someone? Um, is that a reflection of maybe it's too vulnerable to hold back a little bit and see if they're safe enough to kind of enter into that health journey with us? Um, I think that also goes back to like, what's your goal in sharing, right? So, really asking yourself, and this is hard because we don't always know our motivations for what we do, right? But when you are, when I'm writing it on my bio, do I want to, am I doing this to try to rule out people who kind of can't enter into that with me? Or am I genuinely like, no, this is a boundary that I have. I need someone to know up front that this is my lived experience, and it's just not going to work they aren't if they aren't able to kind of engage with that. I would say one of the potential risks of putting too much detail about our diagnosis on like a dating app or sharing that on the first date or the first conversation, um, is because of those misconceptions, right? And it could be that the person we're talking with is a really good, kind person and just doesn't know about narcolepsy, and they hold stigmas, or they have misunderstanding. And so if we share that and then we get that response that we were not hoping for, um, we might write them off kind of quickly. Um, at the same time, maybe that is what you need, and maybe that will be something that kind of gives you a window into uh, their own capacity to kind of handle and navigate some of the complexities of your health journey. So it really depends, but I think there can be good reasons to share early on and also to not share early on. But from what we've seen in the research, sharing too much, so maybe sharing all of the ins and outs of your diagnosis and your day to day on your profile or conversation one, it can be sort of a shock, in at least in a like a Western cultural context where usually intimacy progresses over time. So again, their response, if it's negative, might not necessarily be a reflection of whether they're a good person to kind of commit to or have in your life. Um, any recommendations for dealing with people who make your disclosure about themselves? I find that I usually end up comforting them and downplaying my condition to make them feel better. Whoever wrote this, I want to say I see you, and that is really, really painful and frustrating. Um, yeah. So again, I think part of this will depend on what is your relationship with this person. Is this someone who you feel like you can bring that up with and say, and actually have a conversation and say, hey, I want you to know this is what I'm experiencing when you share this, or when you respond in this way, um, and stating what you need, and maybe, and also again that humanity piece of, oftentimes the reason that happens is because the other person, it triggers something in them or brings up something in them that is really vulnerable or uncomfortable. Um, and their response, as inappropriate as it is, and as much as it hurts you, their response is not uh, probably about you. It's probably about something that they're responding to or reacting to within themselves. So it's tough because at the end of the day, that will be their own work to do. But it's totally fair for you to, um, if you have the relationship with them, ask, to ask them, hey, or to share with them what that makes you feel. If there's someone who will not take that well, and you kind of assess based on the way they've responded to maybe your attempts to do that before, or just what you've observed in their communication, if they can't handle that conversation, then it might be that this isn't the person you seek comfort from, or seek specific types of support from, and maybe redirecting when you're needing that support. And I've seen this in my own life too, where there are certain people who are really good at providing certain types of support, and then other people in my life who are really good at providing other types of support, and kind of turning to different people in different when you're in different spaces emotionally, potentially. Can you talk a little bit about figuring out the right time to communicate about these things, specifically to family friends? Um, Again, this is tricky. Um, it so depends on the situation. I would have a lot of other questions. If you, the person who wrote that, if you're comfortable and you want to write in the Q&A a little bit more of the detail around that situation, would love to would love to unpack that with you, because a huge part of the communication process that we talk about, which is beautiful and also frustrating, is that the context really matters. Who are these family members, friends? What is your communication climate with them? Do you tend to have conversations that feel supportive and understanding, or is communication pretty tense with that person? Um, because the communication climate tends to predict how conversations will go. So if we if we hope, like, there's this family member who every time we have a sensitive conversation, it's we everything blows up, but maybe this time it'll be better. It probably won't. So the climate, like kind of the overall tone or feeling of the communication really matters. Um, and I am seeing your response. Perfect. Mother-in-law has a medical background, and we plan to tell her about my narcolepsy diagnosis when I become pregnant. Um, she has a tendency to go into I know medicine things. Yes, yes, yes. So there's multiple layers potentially. Um, the layer of, if she has medical experience, she knows, or wants to kind of offer her advice and input about that, and maybe you know, be part of the diagnostic process. And then also um, kind of makes it personal. Yep. To me, I mean, again, I think I'd need to know a little bit more, but it sounds like, based on what you're saying, that could be a good boundary. I would say just keep in mind, um, disclosing pregnancy is also a really big and vulnerable disclosure, and a big event. And so doing both of those at the same time, it could open the door to maybe a bigger reaction than if you chose to share about the diagnosis at a different time or beforehand. Um, I do think, to me, it sounds like regardless of when you share your diagnosis, um, there will still be, you'll probably still get some of those responses. And so my encouragement to you would just be really having the people in your corner who know you and who can walk through that process, and who with you, and who you can talk to before, during, after, um, so that if and when those responses come, you have the support that you need. Um, and also thinking through, okay, what how do I want to frame this? And some of the resources that I linked in the handout that's on the Google Doc, they're they're a little bit more geared toward communicating with your doctor, but you can also apply them to your communication with interpersonal others. So there are ways we can phrase things that create a defensive climate of communication, and there are ways we can phrase things that can help try to at least create a catalyst for a supportive communication climate. So maybe some of the wording on those, actually, it might be strategies for creating a supportive communication climate. I would go to that on the handout and see if you can even tweak any of those toward communicating with your family member, and hopefully that would be helpful.